Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Bogdan Radu. I'm a senior lecturer in political science at Babes-Bolyai University, which is also a partner in the TRUEDEM project, which organizes this webinar. I will say a few words about our project at the beginning, and I'll introduce our speaker. Then we will have the lecture for about maybe half hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. TRUEDEM stands for Trust in European Democracy, and it is a 3 years research effort implemented with the support of the Horizon Europe program of the European Commission. If you go to our website, you'll notice that in this project, we aim to collect evidence on the perceptions of trust and judgments of trustworthiness in a range of European states. Also, we aim to develop some type of toolbox focused more on long-term policy interventions that all revolve around the idea of increasing trust in political institutions. We have a very sort of diverse set of activities and then different types of data that we collect, and it's all on our website. Today's webinar is part of our new initiative, which is our Observatory on Political Trust Research. And this observatory is designed as a hub of political trust data, publications, and news. In these webinars, both our own TRUEDEM researchers and invited guests share their research on political trust. Today, we have the third webinar in the series, and we are delighted to have with us Daniel Devine, who's a lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Southampton in the UK. Daniel joined the Department of Politics and International Relations at Southampton after 3 years at the University of Oxford at St. Hilda's College. He got his PhD in politics at the University of Southampton in 2020. He's also affiliated with Nuffield College at Oxford, and he teaches freelance at Lady Margaret Hall. His research interests are in the field of public opinion, broadly speaking, in the field of public opinion, political behavior, and political psychology. And he's primarily interested in how people develop attitudes towards the political system, such as democratic attitudes, political trust, democratic satisfaction, and then also the consequences that these attitudes have for policy preferences and political behavior. Daniel's work has been widely published in the British Journal of Political Science, the European Journal of Political Research, Political Science Research Methods, European Union Politics, West European Politics, and so on. Moreover, he works with a variety of non-academic organizations, such as the Institute for Government and the Open Society European Policy Institute. I would like to now invite Daniel to have his lecture. Also, I'd like to kindly ask those in attendance to mute yourselves metaphorically so that we have this audio comfort. Daniel, please.
Great, thanks so much for the introduction and also for the invite. And also thanks to everyone coming. I can't see everyone because how I'm sharing my screen, but good to sort of meet you. So as Bogdan said, I'm going to speak for, I'm not sure how long, but I'll aim for a maximum of 30 to 40 minutes. And as has been said, as I'm a lecturer at the University of Southampton. So I was asked to present on this title, so the stability and change in political trust. And this will build on 2 papers published, one in the European Journal of Political Research last year, and one which has just been conditionally accepted at the British Journal of Political Science last week, or something like that. Both of these papers are published with Victor Valgason, who's also in the audience, and knowing Victor will have something to say towards the end or interrupt me at some point when I'm speaking, which is more than welcome to do so. Hopefully you're interested in these three questions. What causes political trust? So why do people have political trust in the first place? Why do people and countries have different levels of political trust? But also this debate about whether trust is diffuse or specific. Does it reflect a more deep-seated view on the political system, or is it about more rational updating, depending on outputs of the political system? But also, is it declining, and if so, why? Or indeed increasing, or be just trendless over time, both within people and within countries. The two papers that I'm going to speak about are going to address, hopefully, these three questions and help answer them. Obviously, unfortunately, we can't have the last say on these three questions, but I hope they go some way to answering these questions. And of course, other questions are available that you might be interested in. So if your chosen question isn't here, then it's not that we don't think it's important, or I don't think it's important. Just these are three that I'll be touching on today. In particular, I'm also interested in the consequences of trust, as Bogdan alluded to. And so if you have any views on that, feel free to get in contact as well. Does trust matter for things like engagement and voting, and other political behaviours and attitudes? I find quite interesting. And so if you do, then feel free to reach out. So as a brief overview of this webinar, what I hope to show, and I think we do show, is that at the individual level, the political trust is quite stable, at least in the medium to long term. So over time, people's views don't really change that much, or political trust attitudes don't really change that much, but they do in response to, at least in the short term, things that happen in the political environment. We show in particular, although I don't in this presentation, elections unsurprisingly matter, or at least government turnover matters for your trust in different political institutions. That's mostly what I'll be speaking about, and so I'll mostly focus on this paper. But at the end, or at least towards the end, I'll touch on the question of country level political trust at the aggregate level, but specifically here countries, where we show in a recent paper that trust has generally declined in representative political institutions, so things like parliament and government. But actually in implementing institutions, things like the courts and civil service, it's increasing, at least on average. And we show there's a lot of variation, unsurprisingly, between countries and regions, but in some major countries, such as the US and the UK, it's declining over time. Hopefully, we'll have time to touch on both of these, and hopefully you'll be convinced, at least in our interpretations of these. The data I'll present is for the individual level data findings. It's 6 panel studies in 5 countries. So 2 of the panels are from the US, and these are over the period of time 1965 to 2020. Although our longest panel is only 20 years, which is in Switzerland. And there we look at how trust attitudes within individuals changes and develops over time. For the aggregate level, and this was masterfully led by Victor in collecting all of this data. We used just over 3,000 surveys conducted by 50 projects in 143 countries from the late 50s through to 2019. And to that, we apply various methods, which essentially all show the same thing, which is what I just mentioned. And hopefully this helps us understand the causes of trust at the individual level for reasons I'll go on to next, but also descriptively understand the global trends of trust in different institutions, both globally, but also within countries and regions. So that's what I'll be doing, and I'll start with the individual level. And so part of this is we start the paper that this is published in, which I'll provide the reference for at the end, by recounting a story that John Zahler told in his book in 1992 about a teacher who professed passionate belief in government spending, that we should spend more on education and so on. But as part of a panel study, they were returned to, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks later, where they had decided that they no longer believed this, in fact, and said they never did, and actually wanted to cut spending on education, that the system was bloated and that we needed to rein in spending. And a part of this was about whether people's attitudes are stable or not. That example clearly suggests that Zala, as the rest of his book goes on to explain, that Zala didn't think they were stable and that people moved or changed attitudes according to the, in this case, information environment. But in terms of political trust, our motivation was also that understanding stability or not of the attitude helps us understand why or what causes political trust. So in the paper, we developed this, I guess, topology, and by no means do we think it's the only one. There are many different ways to categorize the causes of or correlates of political trust or theories of how trust is developed. But we felt this was a good way to motivate the logic behind stability and volatility. So I'll assume many people here kind of know these already, or at least some of these. But we essentially believe that different theories of political trust rely or assume different levels of stability of the political trust attitude. Those to the left of the screen, things like that it's just an individual disposition, that it may be inherited or very early life socialization, assume that trust is more stable than not. Once you are past your formative years, in the case of generational change and early life socialization type theories, or in the case of disposition theories, even earlier in life or through genetics, that trust is more likely to be stable than not. But those towards the other side, to the right of the screen, assume that trust is quite malleable, that things like media coverage or scandals involving political elites, in this case, decrease trust for scandals, but also for policy theories, things like economic determinants or policy congruence, assume that trust is responsive to things that happen. So either policy output or how close you believe the policy output is to your own political or preferences. And we believe that at least answering how stable trust is helps us narrow down which of these are more likely, and in part doing so informs us about whether trust is more diffuse or more specific. So these are the kind of theoretical motivations for what we wanted to do, to look at the stability of political trust. And I'll come back to sort of how we reflect back on these theories given our results. So as I mentioned, the debates about the stability or not of political attitudes, not just trust, is very long. It's one of the sort of main reasons that people sort of skeptical about democratic government, is that the public don't really hold consistent attitudes, and so on. But relatively recent evidence is that there's actually remarkable stability across many different types of attitudes, not just those that are deep-seated, things like political morality, which we might expect to be stable, but also things like immigration attitudes or views on particular policies. People hold relatively consistent attitudes. But at least for political trust, the evidence on this was fairly limited. The work that there was relied on relatively short panel studies or single country panel studies. So a couple of waves in the case of the Norwegian panel studies, or for Bauer, who used a long panel study, but primarily, I think, only in Switzerland, but I may be misremembering that. What we want to do is expand this with more specific test of attitude and stability with longer term panel data across a number of countries. So these are the panels that we ended up using. These aren't all the panels that involve political trust. We wanted those with either a long period of time or longish period of time, but also a number of panels, a number of waves, sorry. So we ended up with the British election study in Britain, the Swiss household panel study in Switzerland, the LIST study in the Netherlands, German longitudinal election study, and two studies from the United States. So all of these include at least 3 waves in the case of the US youth panel, up to 16 waves in British election study, although that's over a short period of time. So they vary in their length of time and the number of waves, but they all cover at least 3 waves, which include trust, and in the case of Britain, 6 years, but also 19 years for the Swiss panel data, 13 years for the Dutch panel data. So I won't go into what methods we use. If people are interested, happy to answer questions in the Q&A, but I'll just provide an overview of what we do with these panels and what we find from them. So this graph is essentially descriptive. We look at the absolute change in attitude, scale 0 to 1, i.e. trust attitude, scale 0 to 1, over the entire period of the panel. So along the x-axis is the month since the first wave. So we rescale these to months because each wave in each panel might be a different length of time. So the British election study is many panels, but a short period of time, whereas the US youth panel, it's a very long period of time, but only 2 waves following the first one. And what we see from this, and also the panels, different panels from different colors and with the names annotated from these. And what we see is that change is relatively small. So 0.15 on the 0 to 1 scale, apart from the youth panel, which I'll come back to, but also very similar over the period of time. So let's say the Swiss household panel study, the change from the first wave compared to the second is very similar to the change from the first wave, from the wave 19 years later. The only one that this is remarkably different is for the British election study. So if you've kept up with British politics, 2014 to 2020 was quite a period in British politics, multiple elections, the Brexit referendum, and many scandals. But even here, we see that the maximum change is 0.2, which is not small, but is also not particularly substantial. And that came after Parliament was prorogued, i.e. suspended, in order to facilitate the Brexit deal, which was extremely polarizing. So if anything, this feels like an upper limit for normal politics in democratic countries. But across the board, not only is trust relatively stable across the waves, but also quite similar between countries. So that Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Britain, very similar, and one study in the US. For a note on the US youth panel, the reason that is so large, apart from the fact it is conducted, the second wave was conducted over 200 months since the first one, is also that, as given the title of US youth panel, it was conducted when the respondents were relatively young, and then not for quite a while after that, and also was conducted in the US, but also in the US in the 60s, where they experienced a large drop in trust. So the US youth panel, much larger change, but potentially because the respondents were much younger, which I'll come back to as well. So that's some descriptive evidence that change relatively, or trust is relatively stable. And this is essentially another way of showing this that may be a bit more intuitive. So on the x-axis for each of the panels, it's the number of categories on the original scale. So for instance, in the British election study in the top left, that's on a 6 categories scale, or 0 to 6 category scale. And then the bars, or the y-axis, are the percentage of respondents that change in that period of time. And the different colors, the first to last panel, and the first to second panel. So what we see is that even on, let's say, the British election study or the Swiss household panel study, which is 0 to 10, 0 to 6, 0 to 10 respectively, most respondents, in fact a majority, change only 1 to 2 categories maximum on that scale over the entire period. In the Swiss household panel study, that's 19 years, and in British election study, that's 6 years. We see many respondents will only change, or plurality of respondents should say, will only change 1 category over the entire period. And this is remarkably different between the first and second and first and last, i.e. the change between the first 2 and the first and last is actually pretty similar. So which speaks to the idea that trust is still quite similar. So whilst these are descriptive, we do a lot of other tests, which I'll come back to, which are more parametric. We model different change trajectories, and our results are similar. So we kept to this more intuitive, descriptive presentation. But what we also looked at is another way of looking at change, was whether people's individual events or individual change affected their political trust attitudes. We did this on only 3 of the panels, so the British election study, the Dutch panel study, and the Swiss household panel study, because they have the longest period of time, so we can actually see these things change. Others don't have enough waves or don't have the same variables over time, so we can't test it. So keep in mind that these are just 3 countries instead of the 5 we've used before. And we include work status, political interest, left-right ideology, income, university education, university education, and age. And what we do here is we distinguish between within individual change and between individual change. What this means is that, let's say the case of education at the bottom, within change is the effect of receiving university education. So when someone gets their degree, do they change political attitudes, in this case political trust, over time or not? The between is compared someone who has a degree compared to someone who doesn't have a degree. And so we can see that the between effects are quite large. So having a degree, as you're more trusting, being very, compared to not having a degree, being very interested in politics is related to much higher political trust compared to not having interest in politics, and so on. But the within effects, i.e. getting a degree or becoming more interested compared to not, actually is very small, and in almost all cases is equivalent to 0, i.e. not statistically significantly different. What this means is that as people develop, go through their lives, they become older, they hopefully get greater incomes, they retire and get degrees. This doesn't really change their average levels of political trust. These things are relatively set. And that's the case in all countries studied. There are some effects, so getting older, particularly in the UK, in the British election study, probably because the period it is in. But these effects are very small compared to the much larger between person differences. As I mentioned, we do a lot of different tests as well. So we look at the effect of government turnover in the Netherlands and find that whilst the losers of the, i.e. those who are partisans of the outgoing government do lose political trust, this returns to the long-term average over 2 years. We look at more complex models that have latent growth models that accommodate how individuals change over time differently. We look at different objects of political trust, and all of these are very speak to the same conclusions. What we do find, though, is that when we look at the youngest people in the panels, so people at age 17 in Switzerland, for instance, their attitudes are much more volatile. Unsurprisingly, given what we know about socialization. But after the age of about 23 to 25, attitudes are very stable. Or at least we argue they're very stable, which might account for the youth panel effect and so on. So overall, we argue that in this paper, that political trust is characterized by long-term stability. 73% people change in Britain, even change by 1 or fewer categories over the entire 6-year period. And that's similar to over 19 years in Switzerland. And whilst major life events do matter a little bit, not very much, and often they don't matter at all. And these findings, we think, support the theories of political trust, which mostly emphasize disposition and socialization, rather than those that emphasize rational updating in response to the political environment or policy output and so on. And we think this has consequences for the diffuse versus specific debate, but we can speak about that in the Q&A if interested. Okay, so for hopefully about 10 minutes, I'll move on to the aggregate level. So that's the individual level. Do people's trust attitudes change over time? Now we look at, does trust change over time? In this case, the different aggregates, so globally or within countries and regions. And so this is a very large debate, mostly between those that claim that trust and related attitudes, such as democratic satisfaction, are declining. So this can be, often papers will open with this debate, we need to understand trust because it's declining and it's very important. But this is not obvious, and many argue, as cited here, that most countries, or trust is essentially trendless fluctuation, that it fluctuates over time within countries around some average, and in most countries isn't declining, while some it is. So I think in the US it's fairly obviously declining, but there's still a debate about this, and this debate has been going on since at least the 1970s. And even within our team, so even amongst the co-authors, we disagree, even given our findings in the paper I'm just about to present about whether trust is declining or whether it's trendless fluctuation. So we don't claim to have solved this problem because even within the authors, we still disagree, but hopefully we've gone some way to addressing the problem at least. And what accounts for these different findings is partly different benchmarks. So people take different time periods or different periods of time in any given country, different data sources, such as some use the European Social Survey, some use the Eurobarometer, which might have implications, as I said, different time periods as well. So we measure over 10 years, 20 years, and so on, different types of analyses and different country pools. So the answer for us was essentially to do all of this and sort of see if it made a difference, to put it simply. So we, and by we, I mean mostly Victor, although this developed during our PhDs where we were both collecting a lot of data and we decided to pool it all, but with the support of lots of other organizations, such as Human Surveys Project, which is based out of Australia, and the Data Recycling Project. We have collected all of this data, pooled it all, resulting in about just over 5 million respondents from 50 different projects, 144 countries, and just over 3,000 country survey year observations. So aside from this large data collection, we also use primarily Bayesian dynamic latent trait models, which accounts for the survey item and also country idiosyncrasies and much else. This was popularized by Chris Claassen in his analysis of diffuse democratic orientations, so support for democracy. And we essentially adopted, with a lot of help from him, his code and applied it to our survey data. And we think this allows us to overcome the limitations of existing work, both in our modeling, but also our data collection. Should say we do a lot of other analysis here as well. Stimpson's dyad ratios algorithm, multi-level models, more basic descriptive statistics, and it all more or less converges on the same finding, which I'm just about to present. So this is the global trends, pooling all democracies over time from the 90s to the present day. And we have these 6 different objects of trust. So on the top, we have these representative organizations, or institutions such as parliament, government, and political parties, to the more implementing institutions like the civil service, the legal system, and the police. The intervals are not confidence intervals, they are Bayesian credibility intervals. If people ask me questions about that, I will defer to Victor, who's in the audience, because he's the one who did these analyses. But what we can see is that over time, the latent global trend is one of decline for institutions, representative institutions, trust in representative institutions, and particularly for political parties. We also see it for government and parliament to a lesser extent. And we can see intuitively, which is nice for face validity, the dip around 2008, the 2008 economic crash. So this is the latent global trend for democracies in representative institutions, but we see the opposite trend for implementing institutions. For the civil service, legal system, and particularly the police, the trend has been towards greater levels of trust. But of course, countries vary in their responses, as do different regions. In the paper, we present a wild array of different countries and different regions. Here, just for time and presentation's sake, I'm just going to present this one, which is the different regions. And this is just for the representative institutions, because we think these are kind of the more normatively interesting ones, I guess. If you're interested in democracy, is those whether the representative institutions are still withholding trust. And we find, should we break down here into 6 different regions, still democracy, and we find similar trends across regions. So in West Europe and North America, we find this slightly more trendless, but nonetheless towards decline, whilst in Europe, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the picture of decline becomes clearer, as it does in Latin America. In Asia and the Pacific, however, we find actually a more positive trend, if not trendless, then if anything, positive. So whilst the declines are relatively modest in many places, our multi-level models indicate that between 1990 and 2019, there's been a decline in trust in Parliament by about 9 percentage points, the underlying decline in trust. But in the kind of main indicator of implementing institutions that in the police, that's an increase of about 13 percentage points. And there is, of course, country variation as well, both in direction, i.e. positive and negative, but also magnitude, i.e. the degree to which they are declining or increasing. So whilst the decline, or at least the trends in trust, isn't really about decline in state institutions in general, because we see that these more implementing institutions are still withholding, or if not even increasing in trust. In fact, it seems to be more of a lack of trust in elected representatives in particular, i.e. the representative organisations of parliament, government, and political parties. So it should be seen, as we see for support for democracy, democratic principles, and to a lesser extent, satisfaction in democracy. It's not a loss of trust in state institutions, but particularly in the representative organisations, or representative institutions, I should say. So to going back to the 3 questions I opened with, what causes political trust? Sort of answer from these 2 papers that it's likely more long-term dispositional socialization theories more than rational theories, although they may have an effect during formative years. And of course, we're not saying they don't matter. They just probably matter less than these more long-term socialization theories. And whilst we didn't look at the content of trust judgments, although we do in a separate paper, which we're still working on, the overall level of stability, at least at the individual level, suggests to us that trust is a bit more diffuse than specific. It's probably about your internalized sense of state institutions or representative institutions than it is your rational updating of policy output. And is it declining? In many countries, yes. In some, no. In some, it's increasing. And of course, the usual suspects of the Nordic countries are still wildly trusting of their governments. But why is a question we haven't answered, aside from suggesting that the decline is likely generational, given the stability and given the slow decline or slow change in trust levels within countries, rather than wildly fluctuating. But we're still working on the why question and the few specific question. So I will leave it there. Bang on 30 minutes for Q&A. And here are the papers, if interested. So the latter isn't out yet, but it is on the Open Science framework, so you can read it. Thank you very much for turning up, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for these 2 very interesting. The second one being a bit more depressing, at least in my case, is coming from Romania. But I'd like to invite anybody that has questions to either raise your hand or even just start talking, or also put them in chat. And in the meantime, while you decide to ask questions, I have a couple of questions of my own, Daniel. Oh, no, Pippa Norris has a question. Hello,
Which,
Professor Norris. Please.
no, you're welcome to go first. Do you want to kick off with
No,
two?
no, no, no. It's the moderator's prerogative. I can withhold that for a while.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the presentation, and I'm always enjoying the work that you're doing because it so much parallels our own project with TRUEDEM. So I have a couple of points which I'm going to challenge some of the conclusions you're making. So firstly, the conclusion from your paper in the EJPR, which I read carefully, was basically to summarize it as more or less along the lines that you've obviously just said, but along the idea that essentially trust is largely stable, it's affective, it's to do with emotions, and therefore it must be your socialization. Although, of course, we have no data here on actual socialization processes because we don't have parents, etc. But we assume that it's kind of stable. And therefore, you claim that it's not due to short-term factors like performance, scandal, media coverage, although again, you don't actually directly look at any of those other than some indicators of policy performance. So let's just unpack the concept. What is trust? And if trust has three components, which many people argue, then what we need is some indicators of short-term factors that would relate to that concept. So competence is the first criteria which many people put forward. And therefore, if the government is incompetent or parliament is incompetent or police are incompetent, you shouldn't trust them. That's the rational assumption. So competence is about performance, and you bring in some economic data, but what about other forms of performance? In particular, what I would term democratic governance performance. So we want to look at, for example, a particular scandal in the Westminster Parliament, or you want to look at a scandal where a president has had to stand down because of some corruption like Bolsonaro or Lula da Silva, etc. So you need a major shock to performance, which could then have a short-term, but potentially also a medium-term effect on trust. The second factor is integrity. So again, we need to think about challenges to integrity. And then lastly is about impartiality. So if you have a body which is extremely partial, like the Supreme Court, which has become very partisan in America. So do we actually need to think not just in terms of the general, economic development, levels of economic unemployment or inflation, the standard indicators, but much more precise things that will relate to the concept of trust? And then do we need to break it down also by party? Because clearly, if you support the governing party, then you might discount the criticisms in the media that it's corrupt or that there are problems of its competence. But if you're part of the opposition, you would agree with it. So I think we need a bit more precision when we talk about what type of short-term factors are there theoretically, conceptually, and then empirically. And the last point I'd make, Daniel, is do we need to think about other countries? Because the period that you're looking at is one where there was largely some stability. When we look at, in particular, the countries you picked, like Switzerland, which never changes its government by and large. Britain obviously has changed, but have we actually captured some of the dynamics of that change in the period that you've looked at? We obviously have Brexit in the middle of it, but are there other factors which might go on trusted members of parliament? The Netherlands, well, we haven't had the current situation, which is really critical for the position of supporters of Geert Wilders. Similarly, in Germany, we need the supporters of the AfD, and in the United States, it has to be broken down, absolutely has to be broken down by trust, by Democrat or Republican. Otherwise, it's nonsense, because we know that what's changed since 2016 is a decrease of trust in, say, elections amongst the Republicans, and an increase in trust counterbalancing this amongst the Democrats in, for example, the Biden administration. So do we need more fine-grained is what I'm talking about when we're thinking about the panels, the countries, and the causes of what's going on. So a big question, but thoughts. And of course, lastly, you didn't cite my book, which perhaps had just come out at the time, about trustworthiness. But anyway, those are my thoughts, Tony. And I'm really interested. And as I said, I love the fact that you're looking at panel data. That's great. We obviously need to do that, but maybe the panels and the models don't quite capture what's going on in trust. And again, I take the American example and think hard about what we know about a particular case. How has trust gone down, say, in the Supreme Court after it became so imbalanced? And we know that it has come down. We know that it's responded to the lack of impartiality. Therefore, how do our theories and our tests need to capture that?
Great. Bogdan, I don't know how you usually do these. I'm happy to collect questions or answer them as we go. It doesn't bother me.
I think you could go ahead and just answer these questions then as they come
Okay.
we'll continue to address them.
Great. Well, good to see you again, Pippa. So, as you said, these are big questions, and I think, and I mean, I don't disagree with them at all. I think so. I've written down what you said, so I'm just trying to think through them. So I think, thinking about the individual level stability questions first, I think. So you're right, absolutely right, that we don't include any actual indicators of performance. There for various reasons I'll mention. I would say that I think that one reason is the fact that, to be honest, the paper's already quite long and quite cumbersome, and in the context of a paper, we can only do so much. Nonetheless, I still think that showing that.
Hi, schat.
Showing that these attitudes are stable within individuals, even in Britain, where, like you said, we've had various scandals, the Brexit referendum, 2 or 3 elections, and I didn't show it, but even breaking down by people, so we can look at individual trajectories, they don't change very much. Nonetheless, that leads me on to the second point, where what we want to do as a follow-up is to look at who these changes are. So to look at what distinguishes those who actually do change, because there are some that, there's maybe 10% of people who change their attitudes quite substantially. And who are they? Are these people, like you say, are kind of responding to these different levels of performance, changes in the media environment, all of these different types of things. So we would like to do that, which we haven't got around to it yet, but we would like to. And I think that we almost certainly will find an effect. And I say that because we did look at the effect of government turnover in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands did have government turnover, and we also look at the effect of the Brexit referendum in the UK, which we put in the paper. The first was in the paper, and the second was in the appendix. And we do find, of course, that these things matter, and they matter not insubstantially in terms of effect size. But what we find is that those same people that do change come back to their long-term average. So I don't think we should be, I don't think we should say like, oh, these things don't matter. And it's always hard to pitch the paper. I think that they do in the short term, and maybe that carries on longer than we can observe people currently. But in the short term, yes, but these people rebound over time. And I would say briefly on other countries, for sure. It'd be great if we had more, but we don't. I think the panel studies we have are kind of the dominant ones, at least gives us enough country variation. There are more in the US, which we haven't used, and we should have done. But so that'd be good to cover the US, but I think the country variation we have is the best we can do with a number of panels until hopefully people give us more money to fund more panel studies. I only say that whilst they are stable in the sense that, I mean, these things are always relative, at least the Swiss and the Dutch panel studies include the recession. And I don't think that's, insignificant. We see it in the kind of global trends. You see this effect, and they still, we observe pretty similar stability over those periods. And of course, Britain with 2014 onwards. So you're absolutely right. But I still think this, even if these have a huge effect in the short term, I think these people will likely come back in the longer term. Although hopefully we'll look at that within the next year or so.
Can I add a few points as co-author? So just to say, well, good to meet you, Pippa. Obviously seen a lot of your work, and so I think the first point, fair points, definitely. And we are interested in sort of more fine-grained understanding of what actually shapes political trust and what's it composed of and so forth. And they just weren't the focus of this paper. We have a paper forthcoming at Political Studies with the Conjoint Experiment about what shapes trust in politicians, where we look at competence, integrity, authenticity, and other aspects. And paper, well, we have an R&R at EJPR about trust in governments, where we use more of the competence, integrity, benevolence framework. And you mentioned a sort of third trifecta, people frame it and categorize in different ways with impartiality. So definitely, and we definitely find that all of these are important. What I found sort of fascinating, surprising in all of the panel data that we looked at was that despite all of these sort of different potential sources of fluctuation in trust at the individual level, we found this little variation. We found this little fluctuation. So even, we didn't test for each of the explanations, but one would think that in some of the countries that we looked at, there would be enough variation in either competence or corruption or what have you over the period that we looked at, so that a lot of people would change their trust judgments. And by and large, they didn't, which I think is just a fascinating empirical finding. And I agree that it would be very interesting to look at it by political party and by all the social groups, which, as Dan mentioned, is sort of our follow-up plan for it. But I also thought that, it was fascinating to see that, in the US voter study group panel from 2016 to 2019, if we look at it overall, still quite very few respondents actually changed the trust, whether they were Republican or Democrat. That should have sort of added the cumulative changes of both Republicans and Democrats, but not very much happened. And yeah, agreed with you and Dan, it would have been great to use other countries, because these were basically the panel study data we could find with measures of political trust consistently over. There were a few that had maybe like 3 waves, or that were only among youth, or something that we didn't include for that. Norway and Sweden have panel study data that are really hard to come by and use, even for a Nordic person like myself. I still haven't given up on it, and if you know of other panel study data sets, I'm all ears. So yeah, thanks for the comments.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Daniel. We have another question from Andrew Dawson here. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So thank you for the presentation. I haven't had a chance to read the 2 papers, but I look forward to doing so. So I have a question regarding the findings for the aggregate data. So, you found, and I think it's a very interesting finding, you found an overall decrease in trust in representative institutions, but either stability or an overall, the average overall increase in trust in implementing institutions. So, my question was, because you were using a variety of different data sources, do you have a sense, and I'm not expecting you to comment on each data source because you had so many, but do you have a sense of whether this trend was common across many of the different data sources, or was it sort of an artifact of averaging, and there is, and were there different trends between representative and implementing institutions in some of the sources? And relatedly, I think Daniel had mentioned that there was some disagreement among co-authors about how to interpret some of the data. So I was wondering if there was if this was one of the sources of disagreement or not, in terms of the trends at the aggregate level. Thank you.
Yeah, so I will defer to Victor on the first question, partly because he's been working on it much more, and the appendix is about 100 pages, and to be honest, I don't remember it all, whereas Victor has sort of lived it for the last year or so, so he will be a better place to say that. I would say on the disagreement, it wasn't the survey projects or survey items there was a source of disagreement. It's actually just, I mean, this is interesting, really, I guess, interpreting the overall effects. So actually, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you will, Victor, a plurality of countries are trendless, but many are not. And many are, and the larger ones, such as the UK, US, and other large democracies, are declining. And I think our interpretations were essentially, I was going that, well, a plurality, if not a majority, are actually trendless, whereas some but the overall trend is negative once you pool all of these. And so how you interpret that is clearly up for interpretation. Victor, do you want to have the first question, if somewhat briefly, because we've got 9 minutes left? So
yeah, glad to. I've just sent a link to the supplementary material for the preprint of our paper, which is forthcoming, where one of the things we present there are trends, descriptive trends in trust by service project for each institution in each country. We don't use all of this graph all of the separate 50 projects, but we sort of graph the major ones and combine a few and so forth. I was almost stunned at the extent to which they almost all agree, are consistent, the trends from each. There are a few that that stand out, and usually I could see that, oh, these use a very different scale or something like that. And so generally, yeah, I would just say, and I've sent a link, you can look at it yourself. Sometimes, it's a bit hard to read out, but generally a high degree of consistency across projects, I'd say. The disagreement, yeah, it was one of the reasons I love doing the project, because within the group we've, and TrustGov, and some think it's mostly trendless fluctuations, others think, oh, there's a trust crisis, and Dan and I are sort of from each respective camp. But no, I think, it's just a matter of how you see it, because as Dan said, a majority of individual countries that we look at do not show a clear decline or rise in trust. So you could say that means that the primary picture is trendless fluctuations. You could also say, and I lean towards this interpretation, by our count, about 36 democracies have seen declining trust in parliament, about 6 have seen a rise, and the rest are trendless. And so overall, and if you pool the data, which we did with relatively fancy models, you see an overall decline among democracies of about 10 percentage points. And I would argue that is important and substantial, even if it's not universal or linear, and it differs by countries. We even take the analogy in the paper in if these were individual people and most of them were stable, but we would see in the whole electorate that trust had gone down by 10 percentage points, then we would think that was important, I think. So it depends, as Dan said, a bit on your perspective on it, and we try and do our best to just honestly present all of the data, and think that people might come to different conclusions themselves.
Thank you both. Miroslav has a question.
Yeah, I hope that everybody can hear me. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Victor. I'm a big fan of your work, so congratulations on fine papers. Can't wait to read the second one. And the question that I have is that what you've been focusing on in the papers, at least based on the presentation, it looks like that you are looking into the socio-demographic characteristics that sort of gradually develop over individuals' life cycles. But what about the more disruptive events, like, people getting divorced, unemployed, their partners dying, and stuff like that? Is there any opportunity to exploit this kind of discontinuities in the life cycle? And would that have an implication for political trust?
Cheers, Miro, good to see you again. So we look at unemployment in the first paper, and basically, I can't remember now, but it's either way, the within effect is quite small. The other ones we don't look at, and that's not for really any other reason than we we pulled all of these panels together, and so it might be that would be, it certainly is available in the Swiss household panel, but not in the British election study. So we selected variables more or less based on the data availability. That said, because the results are so consistent across, let's say, getting a degree and becoming unemployed, I would be surprised if it markedly changed, i.e. let's say a partner dying, or you're getting divorced, or whatever else. But maybe. But yeah, we don't test that. And actually, now I think about going back to Pippa's first point, we don't look at socialization, but that's one thing we wanted to do, because in the Swiss household panel, you do have parents, because it's household based. and we just haven't, because it's part of the kind of the next, like, who are the people who do move. But so yeah, that's just, we would like to look at those in a bit more depth. Yeah, time is, yeah, it can
Makes
only be
fools of us all. Yeah. That should be the title of this presentation. But no, thanks. It's interesting, and with marital status, that I don't think I thought of that. I remember in my work on voter turnout, marital status tends to matter, but less so when I look at it with trust. But it would be interesting to see if we can have any, to see if that makes a difference as well.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Then I will abuse my moderator's right. My question is, and I know this is more like a speculation, but what's your take on potentially those institutions that are not elected or representative declining, while, let's say, sometimes what we call force institutions kind of increasing steadily? If it's not an artifact of pulling the data together, what can be behind this?
So essentially, so if I can interpret your question, so what's behind the sort of decline in representative institutions, but increase in
Right.
Assuming that that's, you know, let's take that as that is. I'm not entirely sure in the sense that we haven't tested it. I don't think, Victor. You may have looked at it. My interpretation would be that it goes back to the things that Pippa mentioned, or some version of that trifecta of competence, benevolence, and integrity, or some version of those. And what it says from the US, at least from what I know of the US, and to a lesser extent the UK, is that when these institutions become politicized, like have this Supreme Court becomes more politicized, then trust starts to decrease, or at least when people become more knowledgeable of those institutions. That would be my speculation. I don't know, Victor, if you have any kind of less speculative speculations.
Yeah, no, well, I'm not sure how speculative, but you know, they are speculative. Because I am no expert on trust in police or sort of the legal system or those aspects. I've read a bit on it, and people do seem to think it's a problem. So I was quite surprised to see the clear trends in rising trust in police, which seems to be across our data sets. I just think that's a really underexplored topic empirically, sort of on the aggregate, and I just think it's a puzzle that our work creates. I mean, I think it makes sense to me that declines in trust are primarily for representative institutions, and that I think is, you know, there's something political about it, that people dislike politicians, elected politicians, and sort of that framework instead of, and not just all institutions of the state or government or whatever, and that makes sense to me. Why it's increasing for police is, like I say, some others would be better to come up with explanations for it. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, economic well-being over time, I don't know, border, you know, immigration doubts rising, and so trust in the police or something. I don't know.
All right, thanks. Do we have any last minute questions? I guess not. Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Victor. Very, very interesting topics, presentations. Thank you to Ksenia for putting this together. And thanks to all the participants. And hopefully we will see you at our next webinar, if not sooner.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Good luck. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.